Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you. After sacrificing his own freedom to fight segregation in Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King penned the following words from a jail cell: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." This was in response to a letter written by a local clergyman who called King an outside agitator without personal stake in the Jim Crow laws that existed in a city that he did not live in. Dr. King felt that justice was universal and freedom could not exist when there are different laws set for people based upon the whims of the state. It's the same thinking that informs the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states in part in Article 23, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests. This document makes no distinction between private sector employees or public sector employees. After the entire world had witnessed the abuses on personal liberty during World War II, the leaders of the world agreed that there are rights that are universal and that a threat to justice anywhere should be addressed before this injustice could be spread elsewhere. Even in our own Constitution, it supports these basic tenets by granting all people the right to free speech and the right to assemble, which form the bedrock of collective bargaining. However, collective bargaining must be maintained in the public sector not only because it is a fundamental right, but also because it gives public employees the space to advocate for the people they serve and to keep these essential public services public. Individuals have the right to enter into contracts that are protected by the state. Why would we change the rules when a group of people with a common interest, a union, combines efforts to advocate for themselves? The ability to organize and collectively bargain places a check on the overwhelming power of a corporation or, for the sake of today's debates, the state. To take away a right afforded to some is dangerous, and history has shown that doing so, based on a seductive ideology, can have devastating effects. These effects were the catalyst for King's activism and the UN Treatise on Human Rights. Now, a loaf of bread costs no less for a public service worker than for its private counterpart. Why should they be granted different rights in advocating for their wages? Now, union contracts don't just fall from the sky. Workers organized in a union and management are both tasked with reconciling an agreement both sides can accept based on economic, political, and social reality. Many opponents of public sector collective bargaining use rhetoric to place a firewall between employee and the taxpayer as if the two are playing some zero-sum game with public funds. However, union members have just as much at stake in a fiscally responsible contract because we are taxpayers. Pitting public sector workers against the citizen is a false division used to elicit an emotional response from the public during this time of economic crisis. This is both disingenuous and has dangerous policy implications. Public workers work directly with the public and are the first to hear the grievances and see the effects of policies and how they affect their services. Collective bargaining gives them the space to advocate for the clients without fear of losing their own jobs. Now, for example, we see this in teachers' unions that have advocated for smaller class sizes for their students. Studies like the Tennessee Class Size Project show that, no doubt, small classes have an advantage over larger classes in reading and math in early primary grades. The results of this study show a material need for students to have smaller class sizes. However, the Illinois General Assembly in 1995 moved class sizes to be prohibited from collective bargaining. Teachers became voiceless when their class sizes swelled and learning conditions began to deteriorate. Now, they voiced their concerns to their union leadership, who worked with lawmakers to redesignate class size as a permissive issue of bargaining. and this allowed the teachers' union to define a procedure in its contract for teachers to report larger class sizes than the recommended size without fear of retaliation from their principal. Now, some may argue that this advocacy means that the teacher is fighting for a reduced workload. But what tax-paying parent wouldn't want their child to learn with a class size that is recommended by research and advocated by someone who works directly with their child? What parent wants to entrust decisions about quality of education to elected officials who are not present in the classroom and do not see the implications of the laws they pass? Public sector collective bargaining allows workers to advocate and keep these public services public as well. These are services that are simply too important to be left in the hands of profit seekers. The reason these services migrated to the public sector in the first place is that profit motive shifts the least possible care for the most profit. Now, we learned the problem of privatizing essential services early in our nation's history when firefighting was a privatized endeavor underwritten by insurance companies. Firefighters could only put out fires for homeowners who paid for the right to hang their company's emblem on their house. If you had a competing fire department's emblem on your house, the firefighters would have to watch your house burn down. This was devastating for these firefighters who chose the dangerous work to simply help out their fellow man. Now, the public did not want to capture the same situation with food safety inspection, parks, or their roads. The workers who staff these services want to serve our communities because they are not driven by profit, but driven by a need to serve the community. Just about every public service job exists in the private sector as well. Public workers forego higher wages that they would earn in the private sector because they choose to serve. If profit motivated everyone, wouldn't these people simply take on a role in the private sector? Why would anyone be an attorney for a municipal government if they could make tens of thousands more at a private firm? Public sector unions, before public sector unions, public service had moved to become a patronage system. Some union busters might argue that unions give a job for life, but this is false based upon the facts. However, political patronage can lead to a job for life for the well-connected regardless of their effectiveness on the job. Public sector unions fought to make these jobs open to every qualified individual, regardless of gender, race, or political affiliation. They also fought to professionalize these careers, keeping many from turning into low-wage, high-turnover jobs. Do we want to live in a world where the people who inspect the safety of our buildings, teach our children, or work with families in crisis have under 2 years of experience because they had to leave public service to raise a family? The ability to advocate for proper working conditions allows public servants the ability to gain experience and become better at their jobs. In conclusion, public workers have the fundamental right to organize and advocate for themselves and the services that they provide. We need public sector unions to defend these services and keep them public because the alternative would attract profit seekers looking to exploit the very service that the public demands. Thank you very much.
What is the goal of collective bargaining in the public sector? Is it to advance justice, prosperity, social cohesion? Public sector collective bargaining has led, unfortunately, to a situation where pay raises are automatic regardless of the economic circumstances of the public, where job security is higher than anywhere else in the public sector, and where workers can retire much earlier and with much better pension than those in the private workforce. This turns public sector workers into a distinct class of people who are treated differently from the general public at the general public's expense. Far from uniting people within the social order, public sector collective bargaining fractures it deeply. It strains the natural relationship between people who create value and those who consume its benefits, creating unnecessary ill will between the public and its servants. It creates conflict where none must exist and ensures that conflict is ever present always looming behind the scenes, compelling decent people to demand things from their fellows that they would never dream of demanding from their neighbors. We see this happening today as impassioned protesters demand that politicians either break promises to public sector workers, raise taxes during a difficult economy, or cut programs on which many have come to depend. Teachers are upset in Wisconsin, where Governor Walker recently removed collective bargaining for most public employee benefits. Prison guards in California are on edge because of prospective cuts, where an amazing 11% of the state budget, more than what's spent on higher education, is spent on the penal system. In Europe, the situation has turned violent. These difficult circumstances could have been avoided had a state of constant conflict not been formally instituted between the public and its servants. The source of the conflict is collective bargaining, which intentionally pits worker against manager and worker against taxpayer. Collective bargaining assumes the boss is always exploiting workers and views any move by management to achieve greater productivity with suspicion or contempt. It therefore blocks meaningful reform desired by the public, particularly reform in the government school system. In fact, public sector unions, mostly through the process of collective bargaining, have become the country's most powerful special interest group. Collective bargaining in the public sector distorts the fact that the taxpayers are the customers and that they are the providers of workers' pay. It forces public sector unions to work to curry favor from politicians before working to do the best job for the public. Collective bargaining has created a sad system in which the public no longer regards its servants as honorable, but rather as an elite that is largely unaccountable and immune to the economic forces by which citizens live daily and by which they pay their taxes. It transforms otherwise trustworthy, loyal, and helpful people into a faceless monolith whose monopoly power is utterly resistant to change. It has led to a perverse outcome whereby citizens can be exploited by workers within the public sector monopolies who have the same sort of power that sparked unionization in the very first place. Collective bargaining in the public sector is the very definition of antitrust. Collective bargaining codifies conflict. It anticipates battles before they're warranted and relies on a warped definition of justice whose goal it is to get things from other people rather than address wrongs actually committed. Indeed, workers in all fields, public and private, have the right to associate, but public sector workers do not have the right to threaten a strike if they don't receive automatic increases in their compensation or benefits. To answer the question directly that's been posed today, collective bargaining for public sector workers is fundamentally incompatible with serving the public interest. Public sector collective bargaining is very different from the similar process in the private sector. For one thing, public sector workers possess a higher level of job security simply by virtue of being employed by government. Strict civil service laws apply to them whether they bargain collectively or not. And because government has monopolies in the services it provides, its workers are insulated from competitive forces that cause rapid changes in the private marketplace. But there is a more basic reason public sector collective bargaining is different from its private sector equivalent. Everyone uses public roads. Everyone uses the public sewer system. Everyone has the option to send their child to a government school, although many can choose to send their children elsewhere. Few can choose to send their children elsewhere. Because these services are available to all, we expect everyone to pay a little bit in the form of taxes. Therefore, each person should also expect to get his money's worth. He should expect smooth roads, clean water from the faucets, and schools that educate children well. We don't allow trolls to set up booths on public roads nor bursars in public kindergartens. Why then do we permit unions through the practice of collective bargaining to erect the same sort of barriers to public service? It's unethical for institutions such as collective bargaining to exist in the public sector because it promotes conflicts that threaten the public's ability to access services for which they have no choice but to pay. It is also wrong that collective bargaining in the public sector allows decisions workers' compensation to be made in private, where it ought to be done with full public participation. Far from enhancing a free society or any notion of democracy, collective bargaining increases the cloud of those who have vested interest in ensuring that government spending continues to grow regardless of whether the public agrees. In fact, collective bargaining has contributed to the state's current debt crises. It is not the fault of the teachers, the hole fillers, or the policemen or firemen. It is not their fault, but rather that of politicians who felt they could bend the rules for long enough so that they could please everyone at once. Bad rules lead people to do things they would not ordinarily do in their private lives. Now, many of you will agree that legislation cannot force someone or something to be something it is not. Just because politicians put ink to paper and call it law doesn't mean that it's accurate, appropriate, or even right. It's through civilization that we develop good, effective, acceptable rules that apply to everyone equally. If our rules are not productive, then we must cast them aside and investigate alternatives. Because collective bargaining prevents public servants from being rewarded for doing well, damages their public reputation, institutionalizes conflict, betrays the public trust, undermines representative democracy, and resists reform, public sector collective bargaining must be abandoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It seems like the problem with collective bargaining isn't really a problem of reality, but it sounds more like a problem of public relations. You were saying how this is something that pits the public against the worker. Well, it just seems like there should be more open lines of communication, and we shouldn't just throw away everything just because of the fact that people got bad press. How many people here always believe the media? See a hand. I see one hand. All right, thank you. So, Richard, you also mentioned the idea of pensions, and I think this is a really good issue to talk about because this was a situation where both the taxpayer and the public sector worker who is invested in the public pension system are both being negatively effective. From the onset, public sector workers, as I stated in my opening speech, choose to make a little bit less because they feel the need to serve the public. And part of what we get also for the fact that we're making a little bit less is deferred compensation, which is all that a pension is. Let's go back to the whole idea of public relations. The public relations battle has said that this is like a freebie that public workers have been getting, when in actuality, at the onset of your career, you're told that you're made a little bit less because at the end of the career, you'll have a little bit more stability. The government entity that employs the employee is on the hook to fund this at the end. That is correct. And during times of financial boom, scheduled payments were actually not made in a lot of municipalities and states, and that's very true in Chicago. And now that all of a sudden that the economy is in a downswing, we are being blamed for the need to have these pensions funded in the future. And when I say underfunded, I mean that word is a verb and not an adjective. And although there are a handful of anecdotes that show otherwise, an Illinois teacher, firefighter, or librarian retires with an average pension of about $32,000 a year. And you mentioned also that the collective bargaining institutionalized conflict. Well, the conflict is going to exist one way or the other. Either it's going to be single employees fighting with their bosses, and anyone here who's ever been involved in either a union organizing drive or even anyone who's just had a job, office politics plays such a role in creating a negative work environments. And when you have everyone negotiating with the boss on their own, you're going to have people snitching on each other, and you're going to have people throwing each other on the bus. You're going to have people not doing a lot of work, but maybe finding ways to kiss up, and that just would have a negative effect on the work environment. Now, if the workers can come together, agree to representation, and then have someone at the table debating with, or bargaining with the government entity at the other side of the table. The two have the opportunity to discuss economic realities, and they look at each other's budgets and they decide what is most feasible. So I would argue that it actually downplays some of that conflict. And you also brought up collective bargaining being the catalyst for the issues in Wisconsin, with the Governor Walker taking away collective bargaining and people protesting to get it back. Well, if he had bargained in good faith, if he was willing to take the concessions, or willing to give the concessions that the workers themselves said they were willing to take, this conflict would have been resolved. But the problem was, it wasn't two people on either side of the table working these things out. People were doing it behind closed doors and just waiting for things to hit the fan. 30 seconds. Well, I just want to close with saying that collective bargaining is, not only is it compatible with the public sector, but is mandatory, because it allows public sector workers the ability to advocate for their clients as well as for themselves, and that is very, very much a part of our American democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenzo. You opened up your remarks today with a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm not going to have it exactly right, but I'm going to paraphrase it, that he warned against different laws set by the state favoring certain people. That's exactly what we have with collective bargaining in the public sector right now. I'll refer to a couple other comments that you made. You said that public servants deserve to be paid more so they can do a good job and because they're involved in public service. Well, and they deserve to be paid well if they do a good job, absolutely, and most of them do. That's absolutely right. So in Illinois, he said that people in the public service deserve to be paid well. That's what he said, and I agree with him. In Illinois, compensation per state government employee averaged about $70,000, which is 23% more than private sector worker averaging about $56,000. That is late data coming from 2010. Of course, there's an imbalance between between employees and employers all the time. It's the employer who gives the job to the employee. There's a natural imbalance. But it's important to address problems once they've actually occurred, not to seek them out. And unfortunately, that's what public sector collective bargaining does. There was the comment that, Kenzo, you made that scheduled payments weren't made to pension funds in the states, which is true, but that is directly the fault of politicians that your unions elected. Deferred compensation is very, very easy for politicians to do because they don't have to pay for it today, and they don't have to have the results and the consequences of that today as well. And to say blanketly, which is always going to be a problem in debates like this, I'm sure I've made some generalized statements as well. Not many, mind you, but public employees are absolutely driven by the profit motive. Absolutely. Why else would they want money? Everyone profits. If you're an employee, you want to profit from the labor that you have. Absolutely. Everyone is driven by the profit motive. To assume otherwise is just disingenuous or silly. The problem is that public sector unions assume conflict. They assume that there is always going to be some manager masquerading around trying to exact or find, rather, concessions that the workers can make in order to boost their bottom line. And the point of a business is actually to make a profit. It's true. But when you make a profit, the profit is a signal that you're serving well people who you don't know. And unfortunately, the fundamental difference between private sector unions and public sector unions in the practice of collective bargaining is that there is no choice for the people who are paying the money to have any input into this conversation. It is not done in public. It is not transparent. It is absolutely done behind closed doors, and that is something antithetical to what I believe most of you are here today to talk about. Thank you very much.